Wyoming Territory. Late autumn of 1881, the wind came down off the big horns sharp as a knife. And by the time the sun sank behind the ridge, the girl was already half frozen, her coat torn and her boot sole flapping. Her name was Clara Dorsey, and she had nowhere left to run. She stumbled into the edge of the ranch yard just as dusk folded the land into shadow. The house was small, plain, and set back from the barn. A single oil lamp flickered in the window. The wind carried the scent of horses and pine smoke. She hesitated. Her fingers trembled where they clutched the strap of her bag. Then came a voice, deep and rough. "You lost." Clara turned fast, startled. A man stepped from the barn. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 30, with dark hair that curled a little at the ends and a rifle slung across his back. His shirt was open at the neck, sleeves rolled. His eyes locked on her, steady and cautious. She swallowed. "I need work, or a place to sleep, just for the night, please." He looked her over. Took in the ripped coat, the mud on her skirt, the bruises that ran along her jaw. His gaze softened a little. He nodded toward the barn. "You can sleep in the barn, it's warm enough." She exhaled, chest sagging. "Thank you." He did not turn to go. "Name's Vance Fletcher, this is my place." "Clara Dorsey." He gave a nod, slow. "You hungry, Clara?" A pause. She nodded once. He jerked his head toward the house. "Come on then." Inside, the cabin was clean and spare. A fire burned low in the hearth. The table bore a simple meal: beans, bread, and smoked elk. She sat across from him while he poured 2 cups of coffee, his movements quiet and sure. He did not ask too many questions. She was thankful for that. By the time she finished her plate, her shoulders had loosened a little. Vance leaned back, arms folded. "Where you headed?" She hesitated. "Nowhere, really." "You got family?" "No." That came quick. Too quick. He watched her for a moment, then stood. "Come on, I'll show you the barn." She followed him out into the cold. The barn was warm with hay and the breath of horses. A blanket had been laid over a pile of straw near the back stall. "You'll be safe here," he said, voice low. "Lock the door from inside if you want. No one comes out here but me." She looked up at him. The light from his lantern caught in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a single nod, then stepped back, shutting the door behind him. Clara lay awake for hours, watching the rafters. Wind rattled the boards. Her ribs ached from where she had been hit days ago. Her throat burned, but she did not cry. She had done enough of that already. By morning, there was snow dusting the hilltops. Vance brought her a coat, one of his old ones, worn but thick, and a pair of boots that nearly fit. "I could help," she said over breakfast. "I know how to handle horses. I can cook, clean, anything." He looked at her long. "All right, you can stay. For now." Days passed. She swept floors, mended tack, fed the chickens. She did not speak of where she had come from, and Vance did not ask. But he watched her when she thought he was not. He noticed how she flinched when someone knocked, how she kept her back to the wall, how she never touched the small scar on her collarbone. One night, she came back from the barn with hay in her hair and a streak of dirt on her cheek. She was laughing just a little, just enough to make him freeze as he stepped out the door. It was the first time he had heard it. "You always work that hard?" he asked, coming down the steps. She shrugged. "Feels good to be useful." He studied her. "You want a room inside?" She blinked. "I thought I've got space. Not much, but it's warm." She hesitated, glanced toward the barn. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," he said, simple as that. The next day he started building. Hammering boards beside his own room, shaping a space just for her. He did not say much. Just worked until his shoulders burned and the sun sank low. She came to stand beside him late one afternoon, fingers tucked in her pockets. "You did not have to do this. I know." "Why then?" He looked at her. "Because you needed it." Her eyes shone, and for a long second neither of them moved. That night she moved into the little room. There was only a narrow bed, a rug, and a shelf he had built her. But she ran her fingers along the wood like it was something precious. In the quiet days that followed, something began to shift. Vance found himself listening for her footsteps in the morning. He looked forward to the way she smiled when she stirred the stew, or the way she sat on the porch with her knees drawn up and her eyes on the sky. She, in turn, began to trust the silence between them. She laughed more, worked harder, and once when he handed her a mug of coffee, their fingers touched and neither of them moved away. Then came the storm. It hit in the middle of the night, snow heavy and unrelenting. Vance went out to check the horses. She followed without asking, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Together they pulled feed, cleared the roof, worked in silence through the howling wind. When they came back inside, soaked and shivering, she stood in front of the fire, arms wrapped around herself. He tossed another log on the flames, then turned, eyes meeting hers. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. Then, after a pause, "I was not before. But I think I am now." He took a step closer. Her breath caught. "Clara," he said, voice low. She looked up. "I do not know what that man did to you, but you are safe here. You always will be." Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Instead, she reached out, fingers curling lightly around his hand. "I know," she whispered, "because you built me a room." He drew in a breath, deep and slow, and did not let go of her hand. The days shortened without ceremony. Frost held to the grass longer each morning, and the horses' coats thickened, steam rising from their flanks as Clara carried water to the trough. Her sleeves stayed rolled down now, her hands chapped but steady, and though she didn't speak much during the early hours, her eyes held a quiet clarity that hadn't been there when she arrived. Vance was in the corral with a young roan that had started spooking at shadows. Clara leaned against the fence, one boot hooked on the bottom rail. He glanced toward her as he adjusted the cinch. "You ever break a horse before?" he asked, tightening the girth with practiced hands. She rubbed her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I helped my uncle with a filly once." She threw him into a fence post, cracked 3 ribs. "He made me finish the job." Vance raised an eyebrow. "And did you, eventually?" Her mouth tugged upward, not quite a smile. "Took some convincing." He stepped into the stirrup and swung up. The roan danced sideways, ears twitching, but Vance sat easy, one hand light on the reins. Clara watched, arms folded as he worked the gelding through a slow turn, then another. The horse settled under him, tension bleeding out through its neck. "You've got a clean seat," she said when he dismounted. "Been riding since I could walk." She looked past him toward the cottonwoods that lined the creek. "You grow up out here, northwest of here, near Tensleep. My folks had a place, small but good land. Sold it after my father passed." She didn't ask what happened to his mother. Instead, she picked up the brush and stepped into the corral, running it down the roan's shoulder. The animal flicked an ear but didn't move. "She liked to read," Vance said after a moment. "Bible mostly, but she had a book of poems she kept under the flower bin." "Always thought no one knew." Clara looked up at him. "What kind of poems?" "The kind with rivers and trees and folks dying noble deaths." He shrugged. "I never understood half of it." She rested the brush on the rail. "My mother sang, not proper hymns, old Irish songs, when she was happy." His gaze held hers. "You sing?" "Not anymore." He didn't press it, just nodded once and reached for the saddle blanket. That evening she stayed outside after supper, stacking kindling near the woodpile. He came out with 2 mugs of tea, not saying anything as he handed her one. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, but she didn't pull back. The wind carried the scent of pine pitch and distant smoke from someone else's chimney. The stars came out slow, one by one. Clara wrapped both hands around the mug. "I found some wild mint along the creek today. Thought I could dry it, keep it for winter." You can hang it in the lean-to, he said. I'll bring a board to tie string. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. You always this decent to strangers? He didn't answer right away. You stopped being a stranger when you stayed. The quiet stretched between them, not uncomfortable. She glanced down at her boots. I never stayed anywhere long. Too many doors closed. This one's not, he said, his voice steady. Clara didn't reply, but her shoulders eased just a little. The following morning, she rose before first light and started kneading dough in the kitchen. Vance found her there, sleeves dusted with flour, hair tied back with a strip of muslin. You don't have to do all that, he said, pulling on his coat. I know, she replied. I want to. He nodded once and stepped out. She heard the barn door creak open, then the low murmur of his voice as he greeted the horses. By midday, the wind shifted. Vance returned from checking fence lines with a grin set to his mouth. Something spooked the cattle, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Tracks near the east ridge. Could be wolves. She didn't flinch. You going? He hesitated. Not till morning. Snow's coming. I want to get up there before it lays down thick. I'll pack you provisions. He looked at her then, the way a man looks when he realizes something's changed and isn't sure just when it happened. Appreciate that. She reached for the tin of jerky. I'll wrap it in oilcloth. You'll need dry tinder too. He lingered a moment longer, then stepped away. The next morning she stood on the porch as he mounted the dun mare. He wore a scarf she'd mended, the stitching neat, almost invisible. I'll be back by nightfall, he called. She nodded. I'll keep the lamp lit, he hesitated. You sure you'll be all right? I've got the shotgun, she said. And the dogs like me now. That drew a hint of something in his eyes, something quiet and warm, but he only tipped his hat and turned the mare toward the ridge. Clara watched until he disappeared behind the rise, then went back inside. She pulled the dried mint from the lean-to and hung it above the stove. There was comfort in small tasks. She didn't pace. She didn't sit by the window. But when dusk fell and his boots finally sounded on the porch, she opened the door before he could knock. He looked tired, streaked with ash and snowmelt, but whole. Any trouble? She asked. Couple of tracks. Nothing fresh. Might have just passed through. She stepped aside to let him in. There's Stu. He left his coat on the peg and followed her into the warmth. That night he paused outside her room before turning in. She stood in the doorway, arms folded loosely. I'll patch your gloves tomorrow, she said. The seams are splitting, he nodded. You don't have to, I know. He didn't move. I think about you, Clara. The words hung between them, low and certain. She met his eyes, unwavering. I know, I think about you too. He stepped back, not because he wanted to, but because it was the right thing. But the door stayed open behind her as she turned in, and he knew she'd left it that way on purpose. December settled like a hush over the land, snow resting heavy on fence rails, the sky wide and pale with cold. The creek had frozen over in places, and Clara learned where to step to avoid the thinner spots. She moved with a quiet purpose now, sleeves stitched tight at the cuffs, her boots holding up better than she'd hoped. The ache in her chest that used to wake her at night had gone quiet. Vance came in from the far pasture one afternoon, wind-burned and carrying a splintered fence rail over his shoulder. I'll need to ride to town tomorrow, he said, setting it down by the shed. Post's due for more wire, and we're near out of salt. She brushed snow from her skirt. If you'll wait till first light, I'll come with you. I've got mending I can trade in. He studied her a long moment. You sure? I wouldn't offer if I wasn't. They rode out before sunrise, hooves muffled by fresh snow. Clara rode the mule, her gloved hands firm on the reins, her back straight despite the cold. They didn't speak much on the trail, just the sound of tacks shifting and the wind through the bare cottonwoods. The town wasn't much, 3 dusty streets and a rail line that hadn't seen a train in 5 days. Still, there was a smithy, a dry goods store, and a cafe that served bitter coffee laced with burnt chicory. Clara tied the mule outside the mercantile while Vance traded for wire and flour inside. She stepped into the seamstress's shop with a bundle of shirts wrapped in oilcloth. The woman behind the counter blinked at her, then nodded toward the back room. "You're Dorsey, right?" she asked, sorting through buttons. "The one living out at Fletcher's." Clara didn't answer right away. "I help with the stock." The woman gave a slow, knowing nod. "He's been alone a long time." Since his brother died, anyhow. Clara didn't ask how. She didn't need to. By the time she stepped back out into the cold, Vance was tying the last sack of flour to his saddle. He looked up, eyes catching hers. "You all right?" he asked. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder. "Just fine." On the ride home, she broke the silence. "Your brother, what was his name?" He didn't look over. "Elias. Older or younger?" "Younger. By 2 years. He could outride me by the time he was 10. Always had something to prove." She waited. He didn't offer more, and she didn't press. That night, she stood outside the cabin, watching the moon rise behind the hills. He joined her without speaking, arms crossed against the cold. "Did you bury him on the ridge?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Beside our father, I carved the stone myself." She looked up at him. "I'm sorry." He turned his face toward the trees. "I was gone when it happened. Got caught up helping a neighbor bring in a calving cow. Came back too late." She didn't say it wasn't his fault. He wouldn't have believed her. Instead, she reached for his hand where it hung by his side. Her fingers curled around his, sure and warm. He looked down, surprised, but he didn't pull back. "I used to think I'd always be running," she said. "That there wasn't any place I'd fit. You fit here." She met his eyes. "You built me a room, Vance, with your own hands." He didn't speak. But the way he looked at her said enough. Later, she stood at the stove, ladling soup into bowls. He set the table without being asked. They moved like 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms without needing to explain them. After supper, she sat in the chair near the window, darning a tear in one of his sleeves. He watched her from across the room, elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the spring. There's a corner of pasture I haven't fenced yet. Good grass, but it'd take work." She didn't look up. "You want help?" "I was thinking maybe we plant something there, not just graze it. Could be a place for a garden." She kept stitching, slow and even. "A garden needs tending." "I know." She folded the sleeve, set it in her lap. "What else?" He hesitated. "I'd build a second coop. Chickens are laying steady and there's room to grow." She stood, stepping closer, thread still looped around her finger. "That what you want, a place that grows?" He looked up at her, steady. "I want a life that doesn't feel like waiting." She reached out, touched the side of his face, soft. "Then let's stop waiting." He rose without a word, and when he kissed her, it wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was quiet and sure, like the first snow that settles without sound. Later, when she lay beside him, curled beneath the quilt he'd bought before he ever knew her name, she rested her head against his shoulder and said nothing. She didn't need to. She was home. By late January, the snow had hardened into a crust that crackled underfoot, and the mornings were so still Clara could hear the frost groaning in the branches. She rose before sun up now without prompting, stoked the fire, and poured water into the kettle before Vance's boots even touched the floorboards. The rhythm between them had settled into something quiet and sure, like the slow breath of horses in the cold. That morning, she stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled and her hair still damp from washing. Vance leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching the way she moved between the hearth and the table. "You ever think about where you'd be if you hadn't come here?" he asked, voice low so it didn't disturb the silence clinging to the walls. Clara didn't turn, just reached for the tin of salt. Not often. I try not to look backward too long. It pulls at you. He stepped to the table and pulled out a chair. I was heading out for timber the day you showed up. Would have been gone 3 nights. She glanced over. Would you have left the barn unlocked? Probably. He paused. Maybe you'd have walked past. Maybe, she said. But I didn't. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached for the biscuit tin. You still want a garden come spring? She nodded once. I thought about squash, maybe onions. I can dig by hand if we can't get a plow in. I can rig something. We'll need to turn the soil before the thaw sets hard. She brought over the coffee pot and poured 2 mugs. There's a spot behind the coop that gets good sun. I checked. You already picked a place. I like to know what's possible, she said, sitting across from him. When the meal was done, she wrapped a wool scarf around her neck and stepped outside to feed the hens. Vance followed a moment later, heading toward the shed. The trees beyond the paddock stood black and still against the snow. He stopped at the fence line, watching her scatter feed with slow, measured movements. You ever miss being around people? He asked, not raising his voice. She looked up, brushing her palms on her skirt. Sometimes, but not the kind that talk too loud or lie without blinking. That kind's easy to leave. He walked a few steps closer, leaning one arm on the post. There's a social in town next month. Folks bring pies, dance a little. Reverend's wife asked if I'd come. Clara tilted her head. You planning to? Was thinking I might. If I had someone to go with. She didn't answer right away. A rooster strutted past her boot. You'd want to be seen like that. With me? He didn't flinch. I'd walk in with you or not at all. Her gaze held his. Then I'll sew something decent. Not for them, for me. He nodded once, then turned back toward the shed. She watched his back as he walked. The wind stirred her skirt, but she didn't notice. That evening, after the tools were cleaned and the lantern lit, she sat near the stove mending a wool undershirt that had gone thin at the elbows. Vance was at the table, oiling his saddle cinch. The air smelled of beeswax and ash. You ever think we'll leave this place? She asked, not looking up. He didn't answer right away. Maybe one day, if there's reason. What kind of reason? He set down the cloth. If there's enough between us to carry somewhere else. She threaded her needle again. There's enough now. He stood, slow and thoughtful, then came to crouch beside her chair. She set her sewing aside and met his eyes. We could add to the house, he said. Another room, maybe one with a window facing east. She took his hand in hers, the calluses familiar now. A place for later. For always, he said. That night, when she turned down the lamp, she didn't close the door to her room. He came to her slow, without words, and lay beside her with the kind of care that felt worn in. Their hands found each other under the quilt, and she breathed in the scent of leather and pine that clung to him. Outside, snow fell soft against the roof. Inside, neither of them moved for a long time. They didn't need to. The world had already narrowed to the space between them. The thaw came slow that year, the kind that crept in by degrees, first in the softening edges of snowdrifts, then in the trickle of runoff whispering beneath the ice. Clara stood near the fence one morning, her hands wrapped around a tin pail, watching the creek break open like something waking from a long sleep. The sky above was pale, nearly white, and the first crows had returned, calling sharp from the cottonwoods. Vance was in the pasture, sleeves rolled, driving in fence staples. She crossed to him, boots pressing into the half-frozen mud. There's fabric I can trade for in town, she said, if you'll go with me. He leaned back from the post and brushed his hand down the front of his trousers. You want to ride in tomorrow? I do. I've been thinking on a proper dress, not for the social, for after. He studied her face. After? I've had enough of being only someone passing through, she said. I want to be yours, not just here, not just now, all of it. He didn't speak right away. He set the hammer down in the grass and stepped toward her, brow creased, not in doubt, but something quieter. You sure about that? He asked. I've never been more sure of anything, she said. He reached out then, not rushed, and cupped the side of her face, mud still on his fingers. Then we'll ride in tomorrow. We'll speak to the pastor first thing. She smiled with her whole face, the lines around her mouth deepening, and leaned into his touch. The next morning, she wore a wool skirt she'd pressed carefully the night before, with a shawl folded over her shoulders. Vance brushed the horses while she packed the eggs and dried apples in a basket for trade. They left just after sunup, the road firming beneath the warming light. The town was quieter than usual, the cold still holding back most folks. The pastor met them in the vestibule of the church, his wife arranging hymnals behind him. Clara didn't look away or lower her voice. She stood beside Vance and said what she meant. We'd like to marry before the spring planting. The pastor's brows lifted, but he nodded. You'll need 2 witnesses. I'll ask the McLearys, Vance said. They owe me a favor. It was done in less than an hour. Clara traded the eggs for muslin and thread, and Vance picked up a pair of hinges for the bedroom door, which had started to stick. On the ride back, she held the cloth in her lap, fingers pressed to the smooth, folded edge. I want to sew it myself, she said. I want every stitch to mean something. It will, he said. The days passed in the slow, steady rhythm of preparation. She worked the hem by lamplight, taking care with the seams. Vance cleared the back field, turning over the earth with the mule. He nailed the new hinges into place with precise, quiet movements. A week before the wedding, he brought home a carved pin with a turquoise stone set in the middle. He handed it to her without ceremony while she was pulling bread from the oven. I saw it in town, he said. Thought it might suit. She turned it over in her hand, then looked up at him. It's beautiful. Not half as much as you'll be. She wore that pin at her throat the morning they married. The McLearys stood beside them by the creek, the pastor reading from a worn book. The air was cold enough to sting, and the wind tugged Clara's skirts gently, but she didn't feel it. She watched Vance's face as he slipped the ring into place, his fingers warm and calloused. After the vows, they rode home in silence, not from nerves but from peace. The house waited, sunlit and still. Vance opened the door for her, and she stepped inside first, her hand resting on the frame. That night they sat on the porch as the stars came out above the ridge. She leaned into his side, her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her waist and didn't let go. You ever think about children? She asked, voice low. I do, he said, but only if you want them. I think I do, she whispered. Someday. They sat like that until the fire inside burned low. Then they went in together, and the lamp stayed unlit. Years passed. The garden flourished behind the coop: onions, squash, cabbage, and late-season beans. Clara stitched quilts from old shirts and kept the pantry full with preserves. Vance built a second shed and repaired the barn roof before the first snow came. Their child, a boy with Clara's eyes and Vance's quiet steadiness, was born in the spring of '84. They named him Elias. He learned to walk in the pasture grass, small hands clutching the fence rails. At night, Clara sang to him soft, wordless tunes that had no beginning and no end. Vance carved him a wooden horse, painted with care. They grew older. The lines in their faces deepened, but so did the ease between them. When storms came, they rode them out side by side. When drought threatened the garden, they hauled water together. Every hardship was halved, every joy doubled, and when the boy was old enough to ride, he did so with his parents watching from the porch, their hands loosely clasped, their silence full. The house stood firm through every season. The door never stuck again. The room he built for her remained hers, but she never slept in it alone. They were never apart for long. Not once.